Hello, and welcome to a Producer's Journal podcast. My name is Derek, and I'm your host. And welcome. Thank you for listening. And by now, hopefully you've listened to the trailer. But as I break out these first batch of episodes, I feel like I kind of need to explain what this is and also give more of my history. So sort of get to know me more. So what this is not a educational podcast in the traditional sense. I'm not going to be giving you the 3 best ways to do X and the 5 best ways to do Y. This is me kind of sharing my stories as a working producer and owner of a podcast production agency. This is something I've been doing in total 4.5 years. Started the actual business 3 years ago. So I have a lot to talk about. I love talking about producing. I love talking to producers. And I wanted to have an outlet because I tried to do the informational kind of content before, and it just didn't jive with me. So go ahead and listen to the trailer for more on that. But I am going to come on here and just talk about what I got going on in hopes that you learn from my experiences. So this is very story-based. So with that said, let's talk some history here. Let me give you a little more of who I am and how I got into the podcast space. So it actually starts with the fact that I'm a musician. And I have been a musician since I was 12. I'm currently 44. So 32 years of playing guitar, and most of that playing the bass guitar. So the reason why that's important is because as a musician, you are always looking for supplemental work, side hustles, just to be able to supplement the income. But also, you're always looking for flexible work. That way you can go on the road. You can leave at any time. And then if you have jobs that will be waiting for you when you get back, then that's a win-win right there. But it just is such a headache to always have to hustle, because the music business is very fickle, and you are busy 1 minute, and then you have a month with no dates, no gigs, and you're scrambling. So I did that for 15 years. Started in really hustling in 2000. No more, so 18 years. Here's why it's 18 years. So in December of 2017, I needed to find another hustle, and I wanted something that I could work at home with. Just give me some internet and a computer, and I can do something that earns me money. So I went on Google and just Googled the words work from home. And the top link that showed up on the Google screen was upwork.com. So I'm like, well, okay, what's that all about? So I read into it, and it was obvious that was a pretty nice platform for freelancers to connect with clients and vice versa. So I'm plugging through there, and I'm looking for the easiest stuff I can find on there. Telemarketing type stuff. Just the lowest the lowest bar possible is what I was setting when I'd go into Upwork. Because I don't really have any experience in marketing or data entry or coding. So I was just looking for the easy path. And it wasn't working. Obviously, I wasn't going anywhere, to the point where I thought, man, this website sucks. Like, this is just another website where you're punching in the dark, and you're probably one of a million people, and you'll never be found, and your resume is awful. And I was really starting to get down on it, and wasn't too excited about it until one day I went on there, and in the general feed, job feed, I saw something for editing a podcast. And I'm like, wow, that's very interesting. So I clicked into it, and it was a very basic job as I look back on it. It was just someone that needed audio editing for their podcast. They weren't asking for, videograms, audiograms, graphic design, transcriptions, show notes. I just happened to land on one that was just looking for audio editing. And I'm like, I can do that, because I used to work in radio off and on from 95 to 2005. Odd end jobs, full-time management jobs, part-time jobs. And then the last couple of years I was in radio, I was a commercial producer. I would make commercials that would air on 3 FM stations and 3 AM stations. It was a radio group called Portland Radio Group up in Portland, Maine, where I lived. So I have some experience editing, enough to edit podcasts. I can't edit or engineer a studio where bands come in and record, but I certainly can edit a podcast. So I did what I could to find some old files as a way to show off my editing, but they weren't podcast related, but it was something. I put together the best profile that I could at the time and pitched to that job. So then I was, okay, let's go to the search engine in Upwork and type in podcast editing. And it was like an explosion. And that at that point, that was when my life changed, quite honestly, because I realized that there was a very large need for this. And I found something that I could really attack and engage with. And I did just that. And I shot in the dark. I punched in the dark as much as I could every day. Would just get on that job feed and apply to whatever I could. Search podcast editing, podcast audio editing, video editing, just as much as I could get in that space. And finally landed a client in January of 2018. His name was Dave Turner, and he lives in Baltimore and was wanting to start a podcast from scratch. I'm like, okay. So I was so exciting. It was so exciting. And we talked more. We talked a lot on the front end before we ever started working on anything. And then he finally gave me an audio file to edit for a podcast called Beyond the Table. His space is glassware, plates, decor for high-end restaurants, and he wanted to interview people within the space. So he gave me an interview. This podcast wasn't published yet. I don't even know how to do that yet. But I'll never forget the day when I was sitting in, at the time, my tiny little studio apartment in Memphis, Tennessee. That's a whole other story, is why I'm from Maine and living in Memphis. But I am in there on Audacity and scrubbing through an audio file and taking out ums and ahs, and I'm like, wow, this is so cool. I'm getting paid to do this. This is crazy. I was like, man, this is fantastic. So it really, the snake bit me and sunk its fangs into me deep. And I knew I found something that was going to be strong. Little did I know it would become a full-time profiting business, but we'll get to that. In the meantime, now just doing very light work with him. I might have done some video editing. So again, very limited on video editing, but what he needed, I could do. I got some simple little video software and video editing software. And kind of doing some oddball, one-off kind of editing projects, but nothing in terms of developing and launching a podcast until my next client. My second client was a podcast called The Artist Athlete, and it's a lady by the name of Shannon McKenna, and she wanted to do a podcast about aerial arts, meaning Cirque du Soleil, the people that are sort of like trapeze artists, but with the cloth bands, and they're flying around, and it's like you would see at the Cirque du Soleil, the higher end stuff. And again, she wanted to interview other people in the industry. So I was like, absolutely. Started editing that from trailer to episode 1, so at the very beginning. And that's all I kind of expected to do. That's all it was asked of me. Until one day, the assistant that I was working with, I believe her name was Katie, was like, hey, any chance you can put the podcast in iTunes? And I had no idea how to do that. And I said yes. So, because I knew at this point I had to say yes. I had to jump first and figure it out because I didn't want to say no and turn things down. And I needed to learn. I'm like, okay, I need to figure this out because this is going to happen more. And it was stressful trying to figure all that out. And it was different in 2018 than it is now as I record this in 2022. It was a little harder. Libsyn wasn't as user-friendly, still isn't, compared to Podbean and Buzzsprout and some of my other ones I like. But I had to figure it out, and it took a while to get there. But I finally got there, and I learned from it. Now I've launched and syndicated, as I like to call it, probably 100 podcasts. And that was how it got started. And I just kept going and going. And now that I'm editing podcasts, now I have proof, good demos of my work, and just kept beefing up my profile and beefing up my proposals that I'm pitching to these open jobs. And off I went. And meanwhile, I'm still being a musician. Some of the other side hustles that I had been doing before discovering Upwork and was still doing at this point was hosting trivia nights in the local scene of Memphis at different bars and restaurants. I'm sure you've been to a trivia night before. I was that guy reading into a microphone and then playing a song while you are trying to figure out the answer. You write your answer on the card, you bring it up to me, and then when the song is over, I reveal the answer and then move on to the next while I'm keeping score. So that was me. I drove for Uber and Lyft. I worked for a small auto appraisal company where I would have to just go out to look at cars and take like 20 different photos of the car that had been in an accident, upload them into a server, done, like $20 a car. So it was just such a, melting pot of hustles to still barely scrape by and still only be able to afford a studio apartment and always, have to deal with what I call, eating shit sandwiches from life because you think you're caught up and then all of a sudden you blow a tire. You're like, oh, it's just enough to make it so you have to use a credit card or whatever. So I'm definitely in that space, but I found something that I can do for me. Like I discovered this podcast stuff is my thing. I have more control over this hustle. All the other hustles, I'm beholden to someone giving me the work. Now, podcasting, yes, I'm beholden to the clients, but I'm the one that gets to choose how I go about finding that work. So I had this sense of ownership that I had never experienced before. I finally felt like sort of my own boss, even though all along through all those hustles, you consider yourself self-employed and freelancing because of the flexibility. But now, I don't know it at the time. I wasn't really, into the real meaning of entrepreneurship, but this is when that started. So I just continue to build, and I start chipping away hustles. I'm like, all right, I've kind of maxed out my bandwidth on time. This is really what I want to do. In order for me to grow, I need more time. So let's get rid of the trivia job. Bam. And I really made a point to build that time and use that time to build more clientele. And then I just chipped away, and finally got to a point where I was still a musician, and that was it. It was music and podcasting. And I kind of was getting to that point where I was not having as much time to edit. I was at the time pretty grateful that I had quite a bit of editing. I think at that time I might have only had like 10 clients that I was editing for, or maybe less, maybe like 8. But I had the foresight to think, this is going to be sort of the wall I hit. I can't keep jacking up my hourly rate, because I just can't do that. I was giving myself little raises as I was getting more clients and pitching a better rate for myself. But, at some point I was going to hit a max that matched my value, because I'm not a super high-end editor. So I knew that I had limitations, and I was getting a lot of opportunities that went past me, because they were also looking for a graphic designer to do episode cards and cover artwork. They were looking for people to write show notes and transcribe the audio, and I pretended to be a graphic designer for a minute. I pretended to be a show writer for a minute, or show note writer, and I'm just not good at any of that. So I'm running out of time, and I'm losing opportunities because of the demand for other assets that I cannot do. So this was the summer of 2019, and I realized that in order for me to grow and get to that next level, it was time to hire. It was time to hire an editor. So that way I can push some of my work to him. First gentleman I hired was PJ, still an editor on my team to this day. I had no business giving editing away, because I was still barely scraping by. And at this point, I'm bootstrapping. I'm living on credit cards, both, on personal, to give myself the time to really build this thing. So a friend of mine was like, well, if you're going to start hiring people, you need to up the game a little bit and become an official business. I'm like, okay, how do you do that? So she sent me a link to the SBA Memphis Small Business Association office in Memphis, Tennessee. So I went there, told them what I needed to do. And for a few $100, next thing I knew, I had a LLC formed in Memphis, Tennessee, along with the EIN number of the Treasury. I had a business, and I had to figure out how to run a business. But that happened over time. But I was feeding editing to my new editor, and it just gave me more time to then get more clients. And that thus began the journey of building an agency, because it worked. It worked to the point where I think it was somewhere in the middle of 2020, I edited my last podcast. And at that time, I had a few more editors and didn't have to edit it anymore. And when I say a few editors, none of my editors are working 40 hours a week. But when you hire other freelancers, and I'm sure you, the listener, can attest to this, you have other clients. You can only commit so much to one client. So my editors are freelancers. They're self-contractors, so they work for other people. So one would be like, all right, I'm at about 5 hours a week for you. I think I've hit my capacity. Okay, great. Next, find another person. So that's how I kept building it. Hired someone that could write, hired a graphic designer, hired a transcriber, and started building this infrastructure underneath me so I can continue to grow. And then started getting better clients that needed all the other assets, because now I could provide those assets for them. And that's kind of the quick overview and arc of how I became an owner and producer of a podcast production agency. The agency is called Shelby Row Productions. I probably should have mentioned that at the front end. So June 2019 is the year that I formed the LLC, or the date that I formed this LLC. And as I record this, it's the beginning of July 2022. So for 3 years as an actual agency. And it has changed my life to the point where I took a break from playing music. A year and a half, I didn't even play any music, never mind in a band. I didn't play. at all. I just kind of hung my base up and just focused on this business and grew it. And because finally I didn't need 5 jobs in order to pay the bills, and it was life-changing. So here I am now, running this business, and now spilling all of this out on this podcast. But I don't want to keep these episodes too long. I got a lot of stuff I could talk about, and selfishly too, as I just enjoy talking and telling stories. But I want to build to a point where I am now the entries, as I'm calling them. I'm going to try to not use episodes. I want to use the term entries. Semantics, but is what it is. I want them to get to a point where they're all in real time. So I'm telling a story in real time. But there's a lot of history as to why I'm here and who I am. And I feel like it's important to give the listener my background and be vulnerable, because we're going to talk about depression, anxiety, imposter syndrome. These are big parts of my life, and these issues I have also ingrained into the business, and how I had to work around all that stuff and have some adversity and plow through some fears. But if you made it this far, thank you so much. If you want to engage with me, please go to our Instagram page at Shelby Row Productions and leave me a direct message. Love to hear from you. Go to my website, shelbyrowproductions.com. There you can see what my agency is and what we're all about. And that's it. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.